Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar, the Mobile Biometric Market Landscape. My name is Peter O'Neill, and I am the president of findBIOMETRICS and our newest site, Mobile ID World. I am pleased to let you know that you are joining over 340 of your industry colleagues on this webinar event. And a very diversified group it is, from telcos and venture capitalists to system integrators and governments, from financial and healthcare to academia and law enforcement, and a very global audience as well. So welcome all. Well, a lot has certainly happened since our last webinar, which we held in May, titled The Future of Mobile ID, when Brent Iodora from Frost & Sullivan and Maxine Most, who I will introduce more fully in a moment, both spoke about the importance of the growth in mobility for the biometrics industry. Then all hell broke loose with the launch of the Apple ID Touch on September 10th of this past year. Both Maxine and I were very fortunate to be able to brainstorm this launch with 80 of the top thinkers at an event we held in Tampa called Biometrics Unplugged Mobility Rules, held just 6 days after the Apple launch. We learned a lot during that 5-hour session and continue to learn as the dialogue is just heating up. And it is broadening to now include significant players in financial, healthcare, payments, loyalty, marketing, telcos, device manufacturers, Google, Apple, PayPal, Samsung. Really, does it get any more exciting than this? And does it get any more challenging than this? The next 30 minutes will hopefully provide some insight into the rapidly changing mobile biometrics market landscape. Just some housekeeping. This webinar will last 30 to 40 minutes depending on the questions. And I'd like to remind everybody that we will be taking questions at the end of our discussion today. And to ask a question, just type it into the dialog box in the Go-To control panel on the right side of your screens. And please do so at any time. Don't wait until the end. This will give us an opportunity to manage the questions, and we will do our absolute best to answer as many as possible before the end. Now, before I introduce Maxine, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for their support: Sajam Morpho, NEC, 3M Cogent, and Agnesio. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Maxine Most. I have known Max well for about the past 10 years, and she is very well known for providing original, thought-provoking, accurate, and reliable industry analysis. Maxine is the principal and founder of Acuity Market Intelligence and has more than 20 years experience in international emerging technology market development. Maxine founded Acuity, a strategic research and analytics consultancy, to provide candid, hype-free insight exposing bottom-line issues that drive and shape emerging markets. Throughout her career, Max has provided strategic expertise in emerging markets such as biometrics, identity management, e-commerce, interactive services. She has worked with startups, established technology market leaders, and since 2001, Max's focus has been in the biometrics and electronic identity marketplace. She is a graduate of the University of San Diego, California, with a multiple disciplinary degree in mathematics and computer science. And now I'd like to hand the presentation over to Maxine.
had for a long time, but also the conversations that came out of our webinar in May, and also the event that we had in Tampa that I think many of you joined us there. So Peter told you a little about the company. I've been involved in this industry since 2001 with the focus on biometrics and identity management. And just want to point out two things. Coming in January and February of 2014, Acuity is going to have some new reports, one on biometrics and mobility, which I think obviously all of you will be interested in, and automated border control e-gates. So those are upcoming in the first quarter of next year. So today, why are we here? We're going to talk a little bit about that, what's driving the mobile biometrics marketplace, and then how we model the marketplace. And these models, just keep in mind as we're having these discussions, are generalized models. They're designed to give you some context for thinking about how this market is likely to evolve. And they're never to be taken as a gospel truth or 100% precise, but to be used as guiding tools when you're going through your more detailed analysis of the markets and segmentation based on your specific company constraints, either as a provider of products and services or as a consumer of products and services. So why are we here? What I think is really critical, and this came out extensively in the conversations, again, that we had in Tampa at Biometrics Unplugged in September, is that we're really at a defining, or if you will, redefining moment in the history of biometrics. This is the second time in a little over a decade that the landscape of this market has fundamentally changed. And in 2001, that change was from an unpredictable event, the impact of really an eternal calamity, 9/11, which for more than 10 years has in many ways dominated the conversation about biometrics and also driven the thinking in terms of market development. And now in 2013, we've actually had what I would characterize as a predictable event or a predictable impact, not necessarily long-term predictable that the Apple iPhone 5S was going to be the vehicle for this disruptive technology innovation, but that it was pretty clear that this kind of disruptive technology innovation was on its way. And just to toot my own horn a little bit, because I do say that I have a track record of providing reliable market analysis. If you look at the history of since 9/11, of the predictions, if you will, the forecast that Acuity has made for biometrics, first we talked about the inevitability of biometrics post 9/11. Then there was this concept that biometrics was really the only way that we could effectively bridge the human-machine identity gap, and I think we're seeing that really come into play right now with the iPhone 5S and the imminent onslaught of other mobile devices that will incorporate biometrics. In 2007, when I got my hands on my first iPhone, I looked at it and I said, this is not just a phone, this is a personal authentication device. And the chart that you see below was something that I actually started incorporating in presentations in 2007, and I think that chart, or diagram, if you will, is more relevant now than ever. In 2010, I did quite a bit of work around this concept of person-centric identity and how devices like what I believe the iPhone would evolve into, a personal authentication device, were going to change the nature of the way identification, we saw identification. In 2011, Peter and I were invited to speak at a conference, and we were both talking essentially about how the future of biometrics was going to be based on mobility. And at that conference, when pressed about what this future was going to look like, I sort of spontaneously said, if anybody's going to figure out how to make biometrics work for the masses, it's going to be Apple. So, and this is where we are today, essentially 2 years later. So what's driving this marketplace? I don't think there's no mystery here, right? We have a proliferation of mobile devices. For personal use, BYD in the enterprise environment, and even increasingly in high security environments. There's these meta forces of mobility, cloud, and identity-centric IT, which are all sort of converging together. We're in a moment of time where people are sort of demanding that the critical infrastructure, IT infrastructure that we use as consumers in commercial contexts and also for government are much more flexible and responsive. And I think that is happening really as we have these more and more powerful mobile devices in our hands. And then, of course, we had the September announcement of the Apple iPhone S, iPhone 5S, which I refer to as Apple's kiss, if you will, for the biometrics industry. In the last year, we have seen FIDO emerge, really championing this concept of the death of passwords. And FIDO, for those of you who don't know about it, is the Fast Identity Online Alliance. And their mission is to create a standards-based authentication capability for biometrics and other authentication modes that basically once and for all kill the password. And all of these things together really combine to create an environment where we're beginning to see, and we're going to see even in a more accelerated fashion, sort of a growing mobile authentication environment, if you will, where the volumes move from millions to billions to trillions. And if you think about this in terms of biometrics in particular, biometrics initially, really post 11, were focused on high security environments, on government-based identity concerns, whether those be military, intelligence, or even for civil IDs. And then you're talking about transactions, if you will, or authentication volumes, if you will, in the millions. As we move towards BYOD devices and enterprise transactions and ultimately consumer transactions, we're moving really towards millions, from millions to billions and even trillions of transactions, or trillions of authentications, if you will. And that, it's hard to imagine in a world where you can have billions of mobile devices and trillions of authentications happening without biometrics. So based on all of these dynamics and the conversations that I've had with Peter and others in the industry for quite a long period of time, and the more recent conversations we had in Tampa, the announcement of the iPhone 5S and all of the press that really started going a bit crazy around that announcement, I tried to put all of this together in terms of a model. Some of you are familiar with some models I put together as far back as 2004 about how I believed the biometrics market was most likely to evolve. And what I would say is that, as I mentioned in the previous slide, there was this post 9/11 market evolution, if you will, and there was and some models that I developed that I think have been, pretty reliable over the past 10 years. Now we're looking at a new market landscape, and so new models are required. And so I put these together. And again, just to caution you, these are not precise. These are not built in stone. These are really guides, if you will, for thinking about how the market dynamics are evolving. And these are not intended to be, comprehensive in every detail. So this first model is really an attempt to look at how you can relate mobility to to the other end of the spectrum, which is level 7, where you're talking about, specialized devices, security environments. People have to be externally vetted. The authentication is not happening locally to the mobile device. In most cases, there's some kind of centralized database. And in those cases, obviously, a false accept is really the biggest nightmare you can have. A false reject, well, okay, you can handle that. If someone, is supposed to get through and they don't, well, it's a high security environment, that's okay. And the idea here with these assurance levels is to just sort of scope out what's required. And you're going to see why that's important in the next slide, because what we're going to do is translate that into a market landscape, if you will, where you're looking at assurance levels, authentication volumes, and the type of capabilities that are required. So if we look at this from this perspective of, what kind of market are we looking at, there's a spectrum from sort of the personal device on the consumer side to the highly specialized devices and require much more stringent authentication or assurance requirements on the government side. And obviously, again, these are not fixed in stone. This is a representation trying to show you a spectrum. And I have used these 7 levels to try to identify what I think are critical factors in determining a specific level. But again, nothing's ever going to fit perfectly into a model. It's just a way for you to think about where you are in the marketplace. I think one of the things that's critical here is, and you see this line between consumer and commercial markets, it's, again, not a hard line. It really should be a fuzzy line. I'm working on trying to find a way to make that a fuzzy line in this diagram. I couldn't really find a way that worked for me and I thought looked, came across in terms of a visual representation, so I'm still working on that. But the idea essentially is there is a split somewhere between the applications where self-enrollment works, i.e. I enroll myself onto my iPhone, versus some kind of external enrollment process. And then we layer on this notion of privacy invasiveness. Now, I think that most people would agree that, for high security, high government had with a password entry process, which I was never going to use. So if we come back again and just look at this in terms of sort of the market sectors, I have these represented as rectangles, but obviously, again, these are fuzzier boundaries. But this does sort of give you an idea of where the market has been for biometrics and where the market is going. Now, what I think becomes very interesting is when we go to the next slide and you look at the applications, this is a little bit a finer level of granularity, again, trying to capture where traditional, if we think about the last 10 years, biometric applications have operated, which is in the upper left or purple side of this diagram or market map, if you will, and then really where the opportunities are emerging, which is on the green side or lower right side of this market map. This, I think, also is very interesting. Now, if you don't see your name on this list, please don't get offended. This was not intended, again, to be comprehensive in any way. This was simply sort of trying to, grab some names of companies that made sense given the context of this model. And I think what is so interesting, and if you did attend our Tampa event in September, Michael Barrett, who spoke, who is the president of the FIDO Alliance, talked about the idea of the level of friction associated with security and how to play in consumer markets and even to a large extent enterprise markets, it was critical to both increase security and decrease friction. And so if you look at the consumer end of the spectrum, you see companies like Apple, like Validity, that was just purchased by Synaptics, who is which is a company that is totally focused on user interface and user experience in technology. Companies like PayPal, companies like Google, companies like Square, that are really highly focused on consumer experience. And so what's interesting about the dynamics of the marketplace is that really we have a whole new level of competition coming in to play in biometrics. And so the question is, how do the folks that have been traditionally playing in this marketplace begin to move down to be more fully engaged in enterprise and consumer markets? Because clearly when you're looking at authentication volumes, that's where the business is. Now, there's going to be a sustained business for specialized devices, for very high security environments, but more and more what you're going to see is that the personal devices via BYOD are going to start moving further and further up to the upper left quadrant of this market map. So, what's important here? Redefine the conversation, to have a unified front, if you will, a voice of the industry that basically stops defining performance by failure rates, that stops trying to talk about 100% accuracy, that really gets, that ends up responding and reacting to fear based concerns that are continually raised, and rather come up with a much more proactive and privacy enhancing perspective that we as an industry can present to the world, and to really be honest in a very clear and concise way about what the capabilities are, the true capabilities and the true limitations of our technology. And I also think we have to really leverage what I would call our reality-based expertise, which is we've had both successes and failures in the last 10, 15 years in biometrics. And that should be driving the way that we talk about this technology, the way that we present the technology, and actually the expertise as an industry that we can offer. Yes, Silicon Valley companies move fast, have a lot of money, a lot of technical expertise, understand consumers, and all of those things. But there is expertise in this industry that I think we need to pull together and really leverage. So that's really all I have to talk about today, and then hopefully we'll have questions. Just two simple things you can do at this point to stay engaged. We have created a Biometrics Unplugged LinkedIn group, which you can join. There's some interesting discussions there, and I'm constantly kind of following the news, and anything that I see that I think is interesting or relevant, I post up there. So it's kind of a way for you to stay clued into sort of ongoing market updates, and also, you know, Acuity Market Intelligence perspective on what is actually critical and significant in the market. And the other thing, if you haven't done so, I know quite a few of you have so far. I think we've had, I don't know, between 50 and 100 downloads just since I posted this last night. But there's a market brief that I put together called The Center of Gravity Has Shifted, and it really deals with this shift from Washington, D.C. to Silicon Valley. So I'd love for everybody to download a copy of that and provide feedback. We could bring a conversation on the Biometrics Unplugged group to talk about some of the issues that are raised in that brief. That would be fabulous. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Max. That was a very engaging report, and we have a ton of questions. So why don't we just dive right in and start to try and deal with as many of these as possible. Let's start off with the first question here. Why do you call it disruptive technology? It has been around for a while. For me, it is rather the use case, comfort versus security.
Well, I would argue that in the same way that mobile phones had been around for a long time, when Apple introduced the iPhone, that was disruptive technology. And Apple's expertise is really in the human factors component of technology. I know I had a mobile phone that had many, many of the capabilities that my iPhone had. I had a calendar, I had contact lists, I had reminders, I had messaging, and all these other things on my phone. I could listen to music on my phone. I never did any of those things because it was too hard. What Apple did was transform the landscape by creating human factors innovation that changed the way people interacted with the technology. And that's why in spite of the fact that people may have some fears about what's going on in the cloud. An example I like to give is, you know, I was sitting on an airplane once. This was a few years back when the whole identity theft and fraud issue was extremely big in the press, and it was all over the place. And I was sitting on an airplane. We were stuck waiting to get out. I think we were in Chicago or something, and someone was sitting on the phone making a transaction, and they gave out their address, their social security number, their credit card number on the phone in an airplane where, you know, 80 people could easily hear them. So I think that there are real fears about the cloud, but I also think that if you provide convenience to people and they feel on some level like there is a certain amount of security that's provided to them and a certain amount of assurance that's provided to them, i.e. like, if somebody gets my credit card, that, it's not going to cost me too much money. Now, that's the model in America. I think people will go for this. I think that the hesitancy is going to be real on some levels, but I think the motivation for convenience is so strong that it will drive people forward, and that the security of the cloud environment and the evolution of biometrics in the mainstream are going to move forward together.
Great. And who defines mobile assurance levels? Will phone companies care?
Well, it's funny. That's a good question, and I actually think the industry should be defining these things. I mean, that chart that I put up is a very it's a market-oriented, non-technical approach to looking at assurance levels. It's about trying to understand assurance relative to market development. But I really believe that as an industry, we need multiple biometrics, whether we could use voice alone or voice in concert with something else. I think there's going to be, when I think about voice technology, I really think about, we're using a lot of voice technology right now. We routinely are exposed to people recording conversations when we interact with customer service environments. So I think voice is a natural add-on. And the thing that I think that is really terrific about voice in that context is it essentially becomes an invisible biometric, if you will. It's a do-nothing biometric. There's no effort required, but you can enhance your assurance level very easily.
Great. I have seen rumors of fingerprint sensors integrated into the touch screen. Any information on this? Well, let me start on this one here, Max. Validity, you already alluded to the fact that Validity was bought by Synaptics, and Synaptics is a human interface solutions company. So I think the writing's on the wall on that one. And actually, if you want to get more information about that, you could check out an interview I did with Sebastian Tovo he was the CTO of Validity. You can check it out on mobileidworld.com. But I think, as you just mentioned, Max, this is coming, and it's coming fast, and that's just one indicator. Any other thoughts on that one?
Well, I know that Apple has filed patents to integrate fingerprint sensing into their touch screen, and also the new. I have a MacBook Air, and they have a multi-function gesture-based touchpad. So it makes perfect sense. Again, it's moving towards this concept of like an invisible or a do-nothing biometric, where you have really powerful opportunities to increase assurance on multiple levels while reducing consumer friction or user friction.
Great. And why don't we try and get one last question in? When will Apple open up their SDK to the fingerprint sensor so that third-party apps can use this technology?
Well, Apple's an interesting company. I think eventually they're going to be forced to. I mean, they'll resist because they always resist. But I think at some point they may be forced to do that because the competition
you do not want to miss. And Max and I will be asking questions and finding out about things like, why did MasterCard decide to join the FIDO Alliance? It's going to be a very interesting webinar. And I also want to thank our sponsors again, Saja Morpho, NEC, 3M Cogent, and Ignicio for their continued support. And finally, this webinar has been recorded again and will be available at mobileidworld.com. That concludes our webinar today. Thank you all for attending.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected.